So, hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Lorebeards, another wonderful Sunday, and we have a really, really awesome guest this week. I'm super excited. We've got Lindsay Law with us, which is super great. I'm really, really excited for this. I was so scared of potentially oversleeping. I had, I think, an alarm set for every 5 minutes from like 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. this morning just to be safe. But for anyone that may not be familiar with you and your work, Lindsay, would you go ahead and kind of introduce us, tell us who you are, what you've done, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing to say is that I've been role-playing in the WFRP world since the first edition of WFRP and in various iterations of the war game and side games like Blood Bowl. I've had quite a few Blood Bowl teams. So I've been kind of immersed in this world since I was altogether too young. I first started officially writing for Warhammer in the 4th edition, so about 5 years ago now, where I wrote, and we'll maybe talk about the careers later. I wrote the career section, part of it, was overall responsible for the whole thing, the second pass on it. And I did the pre-edit for the core book, and then editing and proofreading. And on WFRP 4th edition, my job was the massive errata list that was compiled after the alpha edition from all of the community. It was amazing. A big shout out to those people on Discord who bombarded me with literally thousands of lines of issues that we had to fix in that book because it had gone to print so quickly. And now, or gone to PDF so quickly. But before that, because Andy Law and I are married, that's a big, important thing you need to know about me. So when he started working on WFRP 2nd edition, I've always been in the background. So we were playing a campaign through that whole time. So I was talking about the work he was doing. For instance, I would often be doing research in the background. So for Shades of Empire, there's an article in there about the Navy, and I did all the real world research into the naval period that we were looking at and translated that for him and summarized a whole load of books and articles to give to him to be the research material. And then did awesome. Did the same for lots of things for him. And he would often pass things by me, not official proofreading. I wasn't paid to do it, but it was really like, what do you think of this? Does this fit in? The Threnody for Hope from Tome of Salvation is one that always, like, when he told me that one first, I was just, well, I'm in love with Andy anyway, but I fall in love with him like every week again in role playing. Let's be clear about this. And yeah, there was, over time, I think the biggest difference that my experience than other people is I've also been, this sounds really arrogant, but Andy told me to say it, like, not a muse, but because we play together, there are so many of my characters that I've originated or we've worked on the background together that sit there, and I was looking through them because I was like, oh, there's probably one or two, but I went and did a little bit of research for the stream, and in the core 4th ed book, there's like Theodora Holzenauer, who's in the careers, a quote from her.
Yeah.
Sylvester Jutzenbach was a brother of one of my characters, an Ostermarker noble. She became a bright wizard. Birgitta van der Hugenband, who people may know as the Abbess General of the Dark Maiden Monastery, was originally my character long before that avenue of her career panned out. And of course, Erwin Grunfeld is another one from Tome of Salvation. And the biggest one, who I played for the longest, was Sigrid Kuhler, who is in Tome of Salvation as the troublesome young Nordlander noble girl who's got herself pregnant by Heinrich Todbringer. And what I love most about all of those characters is every single one of those was randomly rolled. I didn't roll, and I didn't decide to play a Nordlander noble. It was like pure
the best way
random.
It could happen. Man, you've been ghostwriting for Andy all these years?
Not ghostwriting. No, absolutely not. He was the writer. I was just the creative. I don't know, the creative wall that he would bounce things against.
That's so awesome. I mean, I think that's the best possible way for those characters to have come about. Like, something I think we've seen a lot, like through like the Critical Role series, is how much people are loving these universes that are built off of actual role play or actual people's experiences. Because then it's not just someone sitting in a room like being like, where's my random character generator so I can just fill in this random slot. Like, it adds, those characters are going to be so much more dynamic because there's an actual history behind them. which is so awesome. That's great.
Yeah. In 4th ed, if you look in the career section in 4th ed, every single one of those, none of those are random name generators. None of those are random characters. And if they were created for the purpose of that, but they were created, for instance, to be, if it was a soldier career, it was created as a foot soldier in a regiment we already knew about, in a regiment that I'd met the colonel in our game, or Andy had played, Colonel Sievers as a really good example. And then the final part, so I haven't, when Andy resigned from Cubicle 7, I didn't do any work on the game after that either. But now we're playing LAWhammer, and we're really back into it. And I promise you that things that look random, when Andy's behind that screen going, yeah, okay, you've got to meet a cabbie, or you've got to meet a servant girl, and it feels like he's just made them up on the spot. You know that in 6 months' time, we'll find out that servant girl was actually in the employ of one of the big bads, and one of the, or not even the big bads, because there aren't even big bads. There are just people doing politics.
Yeah, I think I've been playing a game where I'm like, I bet that one's the changeling. No, it's that one that's the changeling.
Yeah, exactly.
The whole time. Yeah. Yes, which, by the way, for anyone watching, if you haven't been checking out LAWhammer as far as just the channel goes and the interviews they do, you are super dumb. You need to go absolutely check that out. We'll have links and stuff for all that down below. But also the Enemy Within campaign they're playing, where Lindsay is of course playing Elementa with, is absolutely incredible. I have been binging it. I still haven't caught up yet because the solo episodes, there's quite a few of them. I'm halfway done with those. I just finished Luitpold's and his little bonus episode, and it is fantastic. Absolutely incredible. But enough on that. Let's move on into more of your goodies.
So maybe we'll talk about Elementa and where. So I love Elves. I've always loved Elves. When I was 6, I think I played my first role-playing game. It was Redbox D&D, which somewhat dates me. And I played an elf called Angel. Nice. A moment of great pride in the naming of that elf. Yeah, 6 or 7 maybe, I think I was. I've got it. I know that for a fact because I've got it in my primary school. What did you do at the weekend, Jotter? And it says I went to X's house, I won't name and shame him, and played an elf called Angel this weekend. And so I've always loved elves, but I've never actually played. Well, I did play, when I was a teenager, I maybe played an elf here and there, but in proper grown-up Wifrip, I'd never played an elf. And we really wanted for LAWhammer for there to be an elf in the party. So Andy and I have been planning for the past couple of years what kind of elf that would be, to allow us to explore some of the things that are not that explored about the different kiths and kins of elves, and also the different ages of elves in Warhammer, the ones that came before the Sundering and what they remember about what the elves used to be, the ones that came after and so have no concept of what they've lost and how small they are. And also we wanted to really challenge the notion of the war game that the high elves are the good guys, and maybe the wood elves are a bit, and the Druchii, the dark elves are the bad guys. We wanted to
black and white spectrum.
Yeah. And we wanted to think about, and so when we picked the Aeonir, it was really because in our interpretation, and I will caveat a lot of this, a lot of what I say is our interpretation of that world,
typical
right?
Warhammer,
there's my hammer, your hammer, so this is how we play it, and in our iteration, the Aeonir are the closest to what the elves were before they split apart. So while the Dark Elves, Malekith remembers, but his Dark Elves, they really worship, the one side of the bifurcated mask of Azurian. They represent one half of the pantheon. And then the High Elves, and they're energetic and they're passionate and they move. But they're political. And the High Elves represent maybe the other side of the bifurcation. They're more languid and indolent, but they're also political. And then you've got the Azrai, who really have gone down a different route and have taken on the forest. They didn't used to live in the forest before.
They're so bound to it. Yeah,
they're bound to it now. And what we wanted was for the Aeonir to have their own particular arrogance, as all elves do, and say, well, we were the ones that stayed true. We worship the pantheon. We see what the Dark Elves have done wrong. We see what the High Elves have done wrong, and we're gonna forge our path in the way that we could have done before Anarion drew the Cursed Blade. and doomed the lines of the elves to sunder. So that's where she is. But
which is super exciting. Like that's a really interesting path to go, because I mean that's kind of a thread that's a little touched on back in like the battle books, as far as like they all think they're correct, but I want to say it was I don't remember if it was 8th edition or an earlier edition that really kind of tossed out the really sinister idea that, of course, when chaos showed up and like they all had to face off against chaos, that chaos suddenly changed each of the races just a little bit, but changed something about them that made them kind of doomed in the long run. Which was where it's like the elves became a little more arrogant and a little more conceited, the dwarves became a little more stubborn than they naturally were, and the lizardmen became like a little more sluggish and all this stuff. But the elves then compound it with the whole sort of Cain business. So I think it's really exciting to draw for an elves that are really trying to reach back, to pre-Phoenix King, pre-Cain, all that stuff.
Yeah. And of course, no spoilers for you, Alamena Wife is only something like 50-something. So what relevance is that to her? You'll need to watch her individual episode to find out that.
Yes. She's already dropped a couple things so far that have been like, okay, she's not being honest about a couple things.
Exactly. As you would not expect one of the political Aeonir to be honest about anything.
An elf being, even if an elf is being honest, what they're telling you is probably like not like the way a human would say honest.
And what I like about the elves is that you're absolutely right. The hordes of chaos came, and did chaos change the elves, or did their own pride and hubris? And in Arian, it should have been enough for him to walk through the flame, but he had to draw that blade. And with elves, it's all about choice. Their souls are so bright and so attractive to demons, but if they fall, it's because they choose to fall. And so did chaos change them, or did chaos trick them into changing themselves? Whereas with humans, chaos does change them. They're almost powerless in the face of chaos. They can mutate, they can, they will be changed by chaos. But with the elves, chaos had to play a cleverer, longer political game to get them to choose it themselves.
Yeah, I think it's excellent you bring that up, because like something we've been discussing a lot kind of in our communities with the Total War news and stuff is that T'Kala has been coming up a lot with Slaanesh stuff, and she's such a perfect example of chaos didn't have any hold over her at all. Like Samael, the demon prince, had to push her through a really nasty ploy of getting her family to turn against her and everything to convince her to fall. Like there was nothing he could do in like a typical human, if it had been a human story, it would have been about, them driving the human crazy or just flat out mutating them against their will. But no, with T'Kala, it's a story about her being pushed to the point that she is so betrayed, so angry, so like desiring for power of her own, she embraces Slaanesh. And even then it takes forever for her to become like really mutated. But it's such an interesting dynamic when elves do fall, because they have such a unique relationship with it. Like even the Chaos Dwarfs kind of were forced into it. They just, weren't willing to die, even though regular dwarves are like, you should have.
You should have died. You should have died.
But I kind of want to walk back a little bit to kind of your passion for elves, as far as what would you say really like draws you to the elves, especially when we're looking at it through a Warhammer lens? What is it about the Warhammer elves that really kind of reaches out to you and grabs you, as far as makes them like a compelling race, or something that's like really worth looking into and celebrating?
Part of the reason for me goes back to another game that we played. And so we played Vampire the Masquerade for like through Dark Ages all the way through to present day. So I played a character who was, by the end of it, like 800 or 900 years old. And through the course of like a decade span of role-playing. And that is really rewarding and really interesting. I studied psychology, so that's part of the appeal. The appeal for me for elves is that all too often in fantasy, elves are just like pointy-eared, long-lived humans. But I really wanted to explore, not just through Vampire, we explored, well, what happens to you when you actually can live forever? What happens to your relationships? What happens to what those relationships mean, and the way you'll interact with each other, and the way you'll log favors, and the things that as humans, we've got a built-in shelf life. We know it's finite, and so it informs our drives and our passions and the way we burn like fire and go for the things we want. When there's not a definite end in sight, how does that change you psychologically? And for me, that's fascinating to explore and a fascinating challenge as a, like primarily my connection with Warhammer is through the roleplay game. Yeah, I've done other aspects of Warhammer, but for me, it's a thing that I do and challenge myself to portray those characters and think about it. So that for me is what it is that they are so fundamentally different to humans, but often they're just treated as different because they're taller and more slender and more agile and elf bullshit, as the other guys in my player group called elf, just the elf bullshit. But actually, what does that mean?
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting thing to say too, because that is often like my big criticism as well when it comes to a lot of elves or dwarves or any other race, is that it's like it's human with a little, like a little slider has been tweaked, like usually a physical slider, not even an emotional one. But the elves of Warhammer have they're so alien, like when they're written well. And I love that kind of exploration of, probably one of the biggest tropes that like really like eats at me is whenever someone brings up immortality or has an immortal character and they're just boring. Like, or they're like, oh, immortality is like, it's only a curse and horrible. And it's like, well, there's a lot of really interesting ways that could be explored. Like, because they wouldn't be like us, they'd probably have a very different relationship with like death and all these other different things. So I love that so much. And I think really, kind of, especially from what you're saying, that, at least in my opinion, I really do think the role play is the best way to explore as far as like looking from lore. Like there, obviously, especially when the battle game, I think it does help, especially when looking from like a 10,000 year timeline of kind of keeping things more broad and generalist. But like, probably one of the most popular things, because the community loves them so much, are like Q&A series. And a lot of the questions people ask are these very nitty gritty things that like, I'm with all the research I have at my disposal, it's kind of a lot of like bullshitting or like trying to read between lines of, and the roleplay stuff, the stuff that you do especially helps fill in those gaps, which is so important and gives people those like, oh, I love that, and I want to do this, or I want to do this, or explore in their own ways, which I think is so critical. So now bouncing back to another thing you said, as far as exploring like kith and kin bands. Like that's something that Wood Elf fans should be familiar with, because it's a concept I can't remember what edition it was introduced, but it's very, very big for Wood Elves. The Azrae though have a very different version than the version you ended up exploring, where for the Azrae it was kind of more of what you were born into, as far as like you were born into a bit of a tribe, and they had a very particular way of working, and it's like, okay, we're this kith band, so we use these weapons, we operate in this way, so we get these bonuses on tabletop. It's a very it's almost kind of a rigid structure. But I'd love for you to kind of expand on, I assume this ties into what they've revealed in the party episodes so far of like the Path of Shadows and stuff like that. Go wild, let us know all about that.
Yeah, so the way we've chosen to kind of rationalize some of those and explore the way elves fall into those kith bands, or in our case, the Path of Shadows, is through the fact that when chaos, so the elves burn brightly, their souls are, tasty food for demons. And they have to come up with ways to channel that safely, to maintain the integrity of their soul, and not to stop them burning brightly, but really to Andy would be able to explain this better than me. To stave off the demons. And the way we've chosen to explore that, because all through the lore there's talk of being on the path of the mariner. There's talk about elves who do the same thing for so many years to the absolute pinnacle of doing that thing. And we've also, in our 10-15 year Wifrip it started in the second Ed campaign. I mean, that ended with a highly heretical ending, which brought in 40k. You know, like we went out of there.
Hey,
and
it can't be any more heretical than the actual end times ended up being. So
yeah, and Andy, because this is what Andy does. You know, if the lore says something and it says something contradictory and it says something contradictory, he finds a way to make all of those things true. Which is why Fenrir in the Book of Days saying, "Yeah, did we come from the gods or did the gods create us?" Yes.
Yeah,
that's what happened.
Yeah, both.
Yeah,
both,
and that's like both. Yeah, that's exactly. And humans going, but it can't be both. And elves going, well, you just don't understand. And you know, are the gods the old one? Yep, but they're also not. But how can that be? And so he had come up with this whole beautiful way of rationalizing all of these different instances of Withrop into one beautiful whole. But part of that was seeing the Eldar and you know, the concept of their avatars and really the safety that the elves get from walking down and absolutely inhabiting the mindset of one of their gods is what protects them from the clutches of another one of the gods. Because as etheric entities, if they are fully in the mindset in this world of that god, then they can't be taken by, you know, that realm of that god is a different place to the realms of chaos. And so that's really what we've chosen to explore, that elves, words are powerful, they're magical creatures, they can, you know, they can change themselves through their actions, and so therefore they have to be so certain and so sure and so clear of what their actions are, and that's where the paths come in.
Yeah, and I actually really like that a lot, and it meshes so well with the pre-established lore of, like, you know, the battle game, for a lot of the units, like, you have these elves that are so, like, you have the Swordmasters of Hoeth, they're so single-mindedly determined on mastering swordsmanship, and, like, they spend hundreds or thousands of years just practicing with this single-minded determination that really, I think, acts as that focus point. Because I think that works so well with the whole thing of, like, elves have very heightened emotions and heightened senses, which is why Slaanesh loves them so much. And that they do have to be so careful, because if they aren't, that's how we got the pleasure cults in Ulthuan. They weren't careful. They didn't have a focus. And so they started getting bored. They started getting distracted. And that led to bad things, and just Morathi taking advantage of that constantly. But I love that so much. And you see it in all the elves. Like, you have the Harganeth executioners are constantly trying to get, like, perfect decapitating strikes, which is a very dark single-minded task, but you know, it works. Or the
that's your job.
Yeah, or the Sisters of Slaughter being those gladiatrix. Oh man,
gladiatorial.
Female gladiators. I know there's an X in there at the end for some reason, but yes. And you know, really cool design, and they're like really emulating Eldrazi, the Lord of Blades, and they're going all in on that, which is great. And then with the Wood Elves, you have, you know, they dedicate themselves traditionally to the forest, or you've got you've got the Way Watchers, like they scream path stuff, where they're these like very stealthy guys with bows who are just constantly melding with the forest, and they are able to walk paths even other Wood Elves can't walk because they're so single-minded and focused on that. I think that's such a perfect expression of those ideas, but brought to a micro level.
And then when you reach the ultimate end of that, as you get more and more like that in the, you know, like that god. I mean, ultimately, you know, you could become, I guess, and you could do what Azurian did, walk through the flame, and literally become an avatar of that god, or you would reach a point where you couldn't not be that anymore. You were so that is now what you are. And that's why you see these elves that are just, they do it for thousands of years, or they do it for hundreds of years. And then that leads to the conclusion, well, if that's the case, in their society, evolutionarily speaking, they would have a deity whose sole function was to break chains and break bonds and bring you back from the path that you were lost on.
Oh, wow, that'd be a really cool thing.
Yeah, and in our iteration, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. That's authority. That's her function. She's the great divider.
That is a really cool way to use that.
The snake that separates that separates in the aether, and when she's gone, and when she's missing, and when potentially she's not doing her job, that's when you get problems for elves. because she guides people on, she takes people off. And if you lost that, and that's where the High Elves and the Dark Elves have kind of lost it. The High Elves have got lost on a set of, one side of the bifurcated mask and one side of the Pantheon. The Dark Elves have got lost on another. But to my mind, Malekith, the High Elves don't know this, but Malekith does, and they're just a tool. He knows. He knows that one day his goal is to reunite the Elves. Is to take what he's made as a tool and use it to do whatever his end goal is, which, you could speculate would be to remake the glory of the Elves as it was before the Sundering, as it was before his father drew that sword.
Yeah, and I love that so much. One of the things that I often, when talking about, like, especially the Dark Elves, because they come up with authority a lot, because she's one of the Sithrai, is that she like the way she was kind of introduced, and like really focused on in 8th edition, like, she's interesting, but she also doesn't really make sense, because they're like, oh, she's a goddess of pleasure, and it's like, okay, where's the line between authority and Slaanesh? Of that, like, they kind of have this, it just kind of seems like she's the pre-Slaanesh version of Slaanesh, which debatably could be a thing, but I love so much the idea of, like, she's this almost temptress goddess that's, no, they're, like, you pull away come back and experience, like, these other pleasures, these other worldly sensations and stuff. You don't have to just purely be
just do
here.
That
actually gives her a role, which is so good.
And I think that's really important to me. So when I was writing those careers, like, you can blame me for the nun career not being a monk career, because Andy and I fought over that, and why would it be a nun rather than a monk? And I know that sounds really random when we're talking about authority, but for me, that aspect of Slaanesh and the pleasure and the sex, like I'm a sex positive person, so for me, for authority to have that pleasure aspect and for it to be positive and functional and natural and form a part of their society is really important to me. And you can argue, so for me, goes back to Fenrir's Book of Days, you can argue that authority is pre-Slaanesh, and you can argue that Slaanesh only is because the Elves were sundered and the Elves have got lost on their path, and authority is now not doing what she was. Authority is now just dragging them further and further into extremes, and they've lost the High Elves, the Azure, well, all of the Azure, the Druchii, and the Azerite. They've got lost on their paths because they no longer have the right people to bring them back and to bring that balance and say, I know you were, lost on the path of that god of the Sithrai, but now you can come back and you can do a different part of your life. And that, for an immortal, fundamentally makes them different to mortals, because we only have time to specialize in one thing, and maybe two.
We ain't got time to worry about that crap.
We don't have time to worry about that. Yeah. What do you do? And ultimately the question is, it's about boredom. We don't have time to worry about boredom. Humans don't have time to worry about boredom. They're driven by survival. Yeah,
and good old Annoy for the immortals. Yeah. Which that's so and that functions so well. Like, one of the things I love about Wolfrup is when it writes about Raya and really explores this concept of, like, Raya has a lot of that sex positivity, and, like, her priestesses are known for being very, like, not wearing very little clothing or very revealing clothing, and really embracing ideas of sexuality and stuff, because they understand that it's a natural part of life. Like, it's just a normal thing. Like, it's nothing to be ashamed or fear. But you have the Sigmarites over there, like, clutching their little hammers, being like, no, it's wicked, girls, the goofballs they are. But by doing that, they're kind of feeding into Slaanesh, because if those domains aren't properly protected, then things will come into that vacuum. If people don't know what they're doing, there's nothing to protect them against the more sinister aspects of it, which I think has some really interesting real world parallelisms too. Of, like, you can't just not teach people things. People need to know. But I love that so much. So would you be able to kind of talk about, if you're down for it, I don't know, obviously don't reveal anything you don't want to, as far as, like, any specific paths, or, like, what kind of that, what that journey is like for an elf, of, like, if they're starting off on a new path, what kind of goes into making that decision in your mind? Like, when you're working with Elemental, what led her to the Path of Shadows specifically? What is the start of that journey like? And how does that go?
too many spoilers for that one. You'll have to wait for that to come out.
Or a mystery randomized elf.
Yeah, a mystery randomized elf. Why might they? Well, for them, why might they go on a path? Because it's about the very survival of their soul. So as soon as they realize, as a young elf, what they are particularly passionate about, then elven society, their cultural norms would be to guide that young elf into the place that they are naturally fall into, and into. In some cases, though, I think for an elf, if you had a moment in your life where you suddenly realized you had a purpose, then that's when you would want to be walking down that path to allow you to channel that purpose. It's a bit loose because, yeah, I don't. As I say, I haven't really played an elf before. I haven't, and Andy has NPC'd hundreds of elves who have all been on different paths, who he all has in his head. He knows why they got there and how they got there. But I would say a path for an elf in the society that we were building is as normal as learning your language from a parent and learning the boundaries of cultural norms for humans. It's not like a big thing. It's not like, I am an elf, therefore... it's not like a human going into the priesthood of Sigmar. Right?
Yeah, it's not a sorting hat situation.
It's not a sorting hat situation, and it's not, in and of itself, it is not your vocation. So you're not like, I want to become a priest of Sigmar. That's my career. I want to be on the path of shadows. That's my career. It's, I want to be a spy. I want to be a glade guardian, and to support me in that, my mental framework is, say, the path of shadows. And they would be helped by those on the path who have chosen to be the priests of that path. Those who are lost, not lost on that path, but those who have chosen that path and that path alone. So many elves will be like, so at the moment, I'm a glade guardian, so I'm on the path of whatever I'm on. And if my kith require me to do something else in 50, 60 years, then I will then move to a different path to allow me to constrain my emotions. So now I'm sailing around the world. Right, okay, I'm on the path of the mariner because I'm exploring. But then there are elves who are just, that's what they are. They are the priests, for want of a better word, and priestesses of that path. A representation of that, a closer representation of that deity.
Yeah, that's awesome. So for people that may be like looking to like role play as an elf, or they're like GMs out there who are making elves for their campaigns, is there anything in particular you would really recommend as far as like mindsets to get into, or questions to focus on answering, or little maybe pit holes to watch out for as far as bringing those characters to life or designing them?
Yeah. So the biggest secret is, remember when you were a teenager, right? And when you were a teenager, and I remember this vividly, I wrote the journal for years and then I threw it away in a fit of pique because I was a teenager. And I've spent the rest of my life being like, why did I throw away all my journals? I want to go back and read them.
Yeah.
But I was a teenager, right? So in that moment, I remember it well. Someone had said to me, don't throw away your journals because you'll regret it when you're older. And I was like, fuck you.
Yeah, how dare you? I'll do what I want. Yeah.
How dare you? I'll do what I want. Because you knew with absolute certainty. And I try to describe that to people. You know, the first time you fall in love, or the first time something happens when you're a teenager, it is everything. Like everything. You forget everything. You forget school, you forget university, college, you forget being polite to people around you because you have one thing in front of you, and that is whatever you have just done for the first time and you want to do forever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we think of elves as teenagers, very long-lived teenagers, very capable teenagers, but with the certainty of purpose that only really adolescent humans have.
Yeah, that's such a good way to put it, of like whether, man, that just brings up so many like nightmare memories all of a sudden. It's like that's I think that's such a brilliant way to demonstrate that to people, of like, that's the level of passion that they should really have for things. And also kind of a level of obsession too, like in like from a human perspective is like, oh, that's kind of that's a little worrisome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. because when you're that age, like, and it is partially because it's all the first time, and so when parents and friends say, like, you know, you're like, my heart's broken and I will never live again. They're like, it's fine, you know, that'll happen again to you. It doesn't feel like it will. It doesn't feel like they could possibly understand. Every song you listen to speaks directly to the events that are happening to you, right? And that's what I try to bring with Amenawith. It's why she's always so, and this is a symbol of whatever, because everything that happens in the world to her is directly speaking to the fundamental issue of her life.
Yeah. Main character
She's
syndrome.
the main character.
Main character syndrome all the way to the max. Yeah.
All the way to the max. Yeah.
That is absolutely fantastic. And that fits so well. Like it I think that does such a good way to help, because like I've worked with like some role players or GMs who are like really, really great. But when they come to a Warhammer Elf, I've genuinely got messages where they're like, I'm stumped. Like, because like one of my only criticisms about like not my only criticism, one of my major only major I should say criticisms with the current edition of Wolfrup is that it tends to be a little lacking as far as like guiding players on elves. And that like it's weirdly like it tends to be such from a human perspective, the way the books are written, that granted, like the halfling portions I think are really well done and do a really good job exploring the halflings. Same with dwarfs, and like dwarfs also have received a lot of attention and are pretty consistent against other forms of media. Like a Lord of the Rings dwarf is not that different from a Warhammer dwarf. A Warhammer dwarf is just like angrier and holds on to grudges more. But other than that, they're pretty similar. But like the elves are like totally like Warhammer elves are so unique. Like a lot of people are like, oh, they're just token elves. It's like, no, they're really not. Like
they're really not.
Token elves are more like angels, like very specifically, or like very, very enhanced humans. Whereas the Warhammer elves are they're so alien. Which is why I get in such a tizzy when like I love Total War Warhammer. I hate the elf designs like physically, because they're like, oh, they're humans with pointy ears, and it's like I like Vermintide for me is like peak elf design. I love Carillion as far as like her design and the way she's voice acted and everything. They did such a good job with her of like carrying that arrogance and that assurity. That when you really break it down, it's such an interesting character. Like whenever Carillion has these little lines where she's like talking to herself, it's so much more interesting than when the other characters do. Because when she has doubt, it's scary. Like you're like, oh, there's something like really wrong if she's doubting what's going on. But I love that. I love that so much.
The other thing I've tried to do, and is I've tried, although elves are so long-lived, you would think that a lot of their actions, they would just be like, well, it's fine, I can get it wrong, I can do it differently. But I've actually taken the flip side of that and said they're aware of the impact of actions and choice. They have to be, because of the unique soul issues that they face compared to other species. And so as a result, everything they do is purposeful. So I've really tried to think about, from even the point of view of where Amenawith sits and what she does, that those things are purposeful. They're purposefully intended. Not necessarily always. It doesn't mean she's always consistent. It just means they're purposefully intended to have an impact on other people or other things around her. She does things for a reason.
Yeah. So as far as kind of going back to the Einir a little bit, if there's, would you feel comfortable kind of delving in a little to as far as like how they people could really role play an Einir specifically versus like the other kind of elves, as far as like how would they excuse me, I had like a little thing in my throat there. How would they feel about like, especially the other elves, as far as like when they're going out into the world and they're encountering the Asur or the Sea Elves of Marienburg, or like a dark elf out there, or even the actual Azrai, these weirdly magically bound to the forest elves. Like, kind of do you have any opinions on like what their thoughts might be as far as like the other race or the other races within their species?
So I think for them, they are. So in our iteration again, Marasith has been there for a long time. the Queen of the Wood. And so she has purposefully not gone back when she was called back, much like the Azrai didn't go back as well, but she chose a different route. So she didn't choose to sacrifice a part of their elvishness to be bonded to the forest. They've chosen a different route, and they've chosen a political route. So how would I say they would appear to the other races of elves? As much like the other races of elves if they could. So they didn't notice that they were different. Like, they're politicians and they're spies. And they will present themselves as they need to present themselves to get the outcome and the end that they want. So there, and if you look, you can see the hints of how the different elves are, because if you maybe this is Andy's character generation, not what's in the core book. I would need to go back and check. But certainly you can get hints of what they would be like from the talents and the starting characteristics of elves compared to humans. And how that would manifest. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's... yeah, okay.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to the dwarves, though, because you mentioned that a little while ago. And the dwarves, to me, are quite interesting. So I did a masterclass for Inside the Rookery a while ago for our patrons on different ways to interpret the dwarves of Warhammer, taking, like, from my background, from, like, an evolutionary perspective. Like, what is the evil... And that's where I always start with when I'm thinking about fantasy species and how they differ from humans, and how you can really characterize them as different from humans. So, like, what's the evolutionary advantage? And what's the reason that they're like that? So for the dwarves of Warhammer, they don't have very many women. They have a ratio of men to women.
It's like 1 to 7. It's crazy.
Yeah, 1 to 7, right? And so rather than just say, right, so they're just like short humans who come from a part of the world where they don't have very many women, I prefer to say, right, so evolutionarily speaking, there's a reason for that. And what could that be? And then I would look to different models of like reproduction and societies that we already have in this world. Like, for example, naked mole rats, right? So naked mole rats are a really good analogy for dwarves. They live underground. They live for a long time. They can only really be killed. Their biggest form of death is like snakes and predators. They don't mutate in the sense that they don't get cancer. Their telomeres don't shorten, so that's why they don't get cancer and they don't really age. They have like a breeding female, and they have this, like, they're really like dwarves. I mean, and then when you think about that, you can say, right, well, if they're really like dwarves, then like, are Skaven like twisted? Everyone thinks it's the greenskins and the dwarves, but actually, is there something in that Skaven also having that underground, the breeding females, is there something in that? Don't know.
Yeah,
but
that's, the spooky thing is that is a question posited by the setting itself. The whole, God,
exactly.
I can't remember his name off the top of my head. There's the traitor ancestor god who they're like, the dwarves think he made the Skaven. Yeah. Which is like,
and then I like to think about, so if you then think about what the dwarves are like, so you could go like that, or you could actually go full down the B route, right? You could say like dwarves have got a queen, and actually that really fits in. If you were doing a different thing, that really fits in with Tolkien, where you hardly ever see a female dwarf, and when you do, they're usually princesses, right? But in Wifrup, again, there's probably more of a balance of 1 to 7. But what would that do then to their society? So they might become more like the cultures in our world where farming is really poor. So there's some cultures in our world where there's polyandry. It's not proper polyandry. What it is a woman will marry a man, but her brothers will stay with her in the farm. And that's a really good model for dwarves. That's why their clans are so important. Because as a man, as a dwarf man, evolutionarily speaking, you probably won't pass on your gene. Right? Because you won't get a chance. There's only like 1 woman for every 7 of you. Therefore, what becomes more important in terms of survival of the fittest and evolutionary advantage? The closest relatives to you. What are those? They're your nephews and your nieces that your sister has had. And that is a perfect model for the dwarven kin. Clan is so important. Honor is so important. And then, you've got from like the real world loads of ideas of how you can then change dwarves from just being like honorable, short, angry, grumpy humans to no, there's a reason they're like that. They have to be like that. And then of course they live underground, so that's why they have runes, because you can feel runes. It's not like writing. What does that mean for the way they communicate? So goblins, you can imagine them like banging drums. So do dwarves have more sensitive hearing? Like, what changes them because of where they live? I
love so much of that, because you also see that like kind of reflected in the setting in a lot of ways of like whenever we have had Black Library authors or the books explore female dwarves, you have that concept of like they kind of almost have these like bodyguards of brothers and father figures and stuff, and like marrying a female or a female dwarf being married is such a big deal with like these dowries and these whole big things, and it's always political in the sense of it's always about the clan. It's not really about really what she wants in a lot of ways, but though the dwarf women actually tend to take that really well in stride, probably because they understand, and dwarfs are very like for the greater good of the clan.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly, because and that's where for me, if I was role playing a dwarf, that's the critical difference. So in our human world, we would see that as a negative, we would see that as forced marriage, we would see that as and by the way, I totally agree with that. Right? In the real world, you absolutely should not be dictated to you by your family who you marry. But dwarves aren't humans, and they don't live in the human world, so we can put that morality aside and acknowledge, we don't tolerate that in the real world. But in Wifrip and for the Dwarven, it's not even that Dwarven women are putting up with it. It's that that's how Dwarven women marry. It's not that the men are picking the marriage for them as the clan. Flip it round. The reason the Dwarven woman is picking the marriage for her clan. Why would it be the Dwarven men that pick for her? It wouldn't be. It would be a clan decision, and she, as the primary way in which that clan reproduces itself, she would be core and heart of that decision. And they worship their ancestors. Well, their ancestors are not just men. Their ancestors, even though a dwarf man has 7 men beside him for every one woman. When he looks at his ancestors, he's got 50-50 male and female dwarves. So the ancestors are peculiarly, because they have to be, more balanced than the actual society. And that would have a massive impact because they worship their ancestors.
Yeah,
they worship each other.
That works so well too, especially like, dwarves, a lot of people think they are, but they're not. They're not a patriarchal society at all. Like dwarf women have incredible roles. Like there's the really famous special character Queen Helga. She was a terrifying badass. She did not fuck around with anybody. Like dwarfs are very. There's even some really funny notes in the lore about how like dwarf queens are noted to be much scarier than the dwarf kings tend to be. And they wield incredible amounts of power. Like even the kings we all know and love, like King Ungrim Ironfist, the Slayer King. Like a lot of people would think he would be the ultimate patriarch. He's not. His queen, Kemma, she has way more authority than he does. Like she strictly is like, no, you will not go kill yourself in this battle. And he's just like, damn it. He
just has to accept it. Yeah, and if you think about it, as a female dwarf versus a male dwarf, if ancestors are how you become gods in dwarven society, because that's what they worship, you're 7 times more likely to be a goddess than you are a god because of the balance of. Because most male dwarves won't become an ancestor because.
Yeah, you're a dead end. Yeah,
you're a dead end.
An honored one, but one nonetheless.
An honored one, but yeah.
Yeah. That's so great. So I do have like various questions coming in from chat that I'm going to kind of jump in as we're also going through some other subjects. So someone asked, do you think, this is a very specific question, but I'm curious how you think Alaminowith would handle it. As far as, what do you think Alaminowith, her understanding of like, I imagine she's encountered her fair share of dwarfs, or at least a couple of them, and kind of maybe having a bit of an understanding that they're supposed to be different from humans, they're supposed to be different from elves. Do you think she'd have kind of a very bizarre reaction when it comes to meeting a chaos dwarf and seeing this extremely heavily mutated dwarf? It's almost a stable form of mutation, but it's this creature that's so embraced chaos when they're not supposed to.
Yeah, so I think Alamenoith, she's quite unusual because she is so young, and she's hasn't met that many dwarves, but she knows enough to know what dwarves are and what the hallmarks of a dwarf is. And I think if Alamenoith met a chaos dwarf, she would be absolutely, it would further strengthen her conviction that what she's doing is right because the end times are here. Because dwarves shouldn't be like that. And the fact that dwarves are like that means the architect's plan and the ruinous powers plan is so far advanced that they're not even at 5 minutes to midnight anymore. They're now at 1 minute to midnight because the impossible
DEFCON 1
has happened. Yeah. So it would strengthen her conviction and also like absolutely terrify her.
Right.
She'd be horrified.
Yes.
There's French toast and sausage.
Great. I'm in the middle of something. Awesome. So going from that, okay, here we go. So there's someone that asks a weird question about a personal game I'm running. So in my game, I'm playing oh wow, this is interesting. They're playing a wood elven shapeshifter, running under the idea that they're an offspring of Orion and Ariel, and they're curious if this is a very interesting question. Okay, I will kind of toss my own answer in on this. So they're running under the idea that being a child of Orion and Ariel, they might have more than one soul, being the child of two gods. And that might explain how they could be related to like the Sisters of Twilight, being an entity that seemed to be split. I think there's a reasonable basis there. It's definitely a stretch. I would say that Orion and Ariel probably are not in the business of producing children as far as like physically being able to anymore. But more probably because of Orion's nature than Ariel's, where Orion is kind of like a weird reincarnating entity. Oh, wrong scene. Thank you. Hold on. So for anyone, I got briefly interrupted by my loving family being like, "There's food downstairs." And it's like, that's great. I'm busy. French toast sounds awesome. I'll heat it up later. No, I do think that's an interesting idea especially, and I do think a wood elf is probably the best way to explore that idea. I also want to jump in with that. Of when you're dealing with the Azrae, weird stuff happens in Athel Loren. It's basically the realm of chaos, but just a wood version of it. Like, it's a strange place. It doesn't work with time. It doesn't work with like space. Like, it's weird. And we do have weird situations like the Sisters of Twilight, who a lot of people think are Ariel and Orion's kids, but they're not. They're Ariel, purely Ariel. What the lore seems to suggest is that they are, when Ariel went really heavy into dark magic and kind of corrupted herself in a sense, she wanted to purify that out of herself because it started darkening a lot of her decisions. But she kind of seemed to have gone a little over far, and she took the two most extreme forms of her emotions, the really like bright light side, a lot of her mercy and pity, and she also took this urge for battle, this desire for bloodshed, this like the more pitiless side, and she separated those from herself. And this seems to have split into these two children who are connected to her, Nystra and Arahan, but they are reflections of Ariel. She is their mother, but Orion is not their father. When Orion, the first time Orion ever meets them is when they show up at the Kingsglade and they're like, "We represent Ariel." And Orion, like, everyone looks at Orion and he looks at them as kind of like, "Yeah, all right." Like, I could sense their mother in them. And he was not thrilled because he knew that meant Ariel was staying away. She was remaining in exile. But he didn't know them. And they showed up fully grown. Like, they just appeared one day. There is also, of course, the myth that a child wandered into Athel Loren and the forest itself changed that child and split them into two people that had either side of that soul. I think there's truth to that myth, but it is from the perspective of they split off of Ariel. And it was Ariel's way of balancing herself out in the way that a god would. A demigod, as opposed to like a regular mortal. But I don't know if you have a personal theory kind of running in your head about that.
I think how I would potentially think about it and rationalize it, and it's an option, is that you would make that child, your character, like a representation of the state of the Azrai. So you would have their soul being split because they got an elven soul, and they also got the spirit of the wood. So that, you know, that as Orion and Orion and Ariel kind of reflect that seasonal, you know, they come, they live, he die. I think I would do it like that, and so I would say that's what they've got. You maybe got the elven soul from Ariel, and the spirit of the wood from Orion, and but you still have like a split soul. But fundamentally, it reflects in that character because it's the child of them both. So if you think of a child as the thing that they have wrought together, that's what I would do. What they have wrought together is a changing and a weirdness to an elf soul.
Yeah, I also really like that because that fits in really well to like a shapeshifter as far as like they have that seasonal weirdness. Also, like, and for who was that? Kesslaughter, that actually works great because like wood elves are really well known for putting changelings, which it's a really fucked up thing if you think about it too much, but they like steal Bretonnian babies and replace them with changelings. Like that is something they absolutely do to like influence the dukes and stuff. So yeah, you could actually do that. But yeah, hopefully that helps and provide some stuff. So getting kind of back into a topic, one of the things I've been very, very lucky and privileged to have had the opportunity to chat with Lindsay before. And one of the things that I love so much, and like it really helps explore in my mind potential for Warhammer Fantasy is really, I think the lure of the battle game that is a very tricky trap to fall into, that everyone, if you care about lore, needs to avoid, is that the battle game, for the sake of the battle game, states absolutes. It says things like, these guys are evil, these guys are good, like these guys are order, these guys are destruction, these gods are evil, these gods are not, when it's really not like that at all. It's a spectrum of gray. And one of the things that I talked about a little bit with Lindsay in the past, and I'd love for you to kind of expand on, is the concept of like taking a race that if you put 10 Warhammer players in a room and ask them, is this race evil? They'd all 10 of them would say yes. And that's the Beastmen of Chaos. Of that, maybe the Beastmen aren't quite as, like through circumstance, yes, they're all like come off as evil, and maybe they all kind of hate civilization in a way because it's had such a dramatic impact on them and a lot of their world and stuff, and that they had a pre-established order. Humanity came in and was like, nah, we're going to chop all these trees down, burn off, you know, all the grass, make fields, and we're going to change everything, and chase y'all out. But I recall you mentioning a Beastmen of Tall concept.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, where that came from was I was playing that character I mentioned, Sigrid, and she grew up in Nordland. So she grew up right on the north coast of the Empire. And because of that, you know, in the lore, the Norskins, they do trade, right? So they do trade with Marienburg. They do other things too, but they do trade. And what that means, logically, therefore, it means that there are some Norskins who are not as deeply entrenched in worshipping chaos as others. Right? So it means there's a spectrum of chaos worship as you go north, and it makes sense, right? So there are tribes of Norskins who literally were chased out of the Empire by Sigmar, you know, over the sea. They lived in the Empire before. They were just like tribes. They didn't worship chaos then. In fact, they were chased out because they just didn't submit to Sigmar. And then they went north, and as you go north, the reality of chaos becomes realer in Wifrip. And so, therefore, in a world that's already a pantheon, if you're, you know, giving birth to a child and you're in Norska, yeah, you might pray to Raya, or you might pray to Dairath, or whatever version of that god you have. But you'll also have a spiritual advisor, a Vicky, or whatever, who advises you on how to appease all the gods. So for them, it's not like in the Empire where the chaos gods are outlawed and therefore it is illegal to do it. And once something becomes illegal and taboo, it has a connotation of evil, and therefore it then becomes like, if you live up north, your children might be born mutated. Does that mean they're born evil? Well, I fundamentally reject that. How can a baby be born evil just because it's mutated? So the reality of day-to-day life for Norskins is that they are closer to the Weeping Eye, and they have to try to placate all the gods around them and survive. Right? That's the reality of humanity. Is to survive.
And it's hard living up there. It's hard living
up there, right? So that's where it started. And some Norscan tribes choose to do that by following Khorne and by, imposing their will on others, by raiding, by taking slaves. Some of them choose to do it through politics. Some of them choose to do it through trading and may worship a selection of gods, including some of the Chaos gods, but also including some of the gods that you would know in the Empire. So that's where it started, that there's a spectrum. And once it becomes not black and white, then everything is up for debate on whether it's black and white. And what is fundamentally bad about beastmen, apart from in our real world, like a human slight revulsion at there being like a person's body with a beast head on it. But if you think about it, they reproduce and they have children, which means beastmen have families, which means those families travel through the forest, they live in war bands, in war herds. They can't, and they live lives.
Quit bumping in, Andy. I hear you back there.
Yeah, correct. And they live lives that are just lives. Like, how is that so different from being a human? So however, they have been hunted and herded and corrupted sometimes. They've been persecuted. They've been set against humans. They've been pushed into the farthest reaches of the forest. And they have been used by forces of Northmen, by
and Chaos treats them terribly. Like the lore is it's very explicit that the Dark Gods they don't care. They already have the Beastman souls. They're like, whatever.
Whatever. Yeah, exactly. But if you live in, I don't know, the woods of Talabheim, of Talabek land even, and you're just a tribe of beastmen that have lived there for centuries, for thousands of years, what is it about you that's innately? How would you even know about chaos? Like, so if you took a beastman baby and raised it, would it be brutal? Well, it probably is, because they're predators. They eat meat. They've got sharp teeth. But humans are brutal. Yeah. Like, let's not pretend that beastmen do actually that much.
It's like people have cats
that really bad
pets,
humans do.
And you see what cats do if they cats torture things for fun. Like, but we love them.
So the idea that this character had, based on her personal experience, was like, so in the north, they worship Ulrich as the god of war. So why wouldn't the beastmen of the forest worship a horned god? Like, I don't, and she just didn't understand. And then that led her to say, well, if I could go north and I could convert Norskins to the worship of Ulrich, which she, had some success in doing with Norskins who had come to the Empire, then why couldn't you go into the forests and be a missionary to beastmen and help them turn away from the lure and the raw power and the immediate power of the ruinous powers and turn to Tal? Why wouldn't that be possible? Because if it isn't possible, then you have to accept that some races in Withrop are inherently evil. And by the way, if that's your Warhammer, you can choose to do that.
Yeah, it does make things a lot easier.
It does make things a lot easier. But if you're asking questions about Warhammer as a world in which people and beastmen live, not just to be on the other side of the war game, then it does prompt questions like that. Well, so that's what she had a plan to do.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense, because like something that's kind of looming on the horizon for a lot of Warhammer fans is that, with the old world coming back and like the Total War game pushing into places we never imagined we were finally going to get to go, like Grand Cathay is now just a thing. A lot of people are really hoping we're going to see like the Kingdoms of End. And the Kingdoms of End are so famous for having the Tigermen. Like, it's such a famous aspect of their culture. And it's like, people are like, but aren't the Tigermen just beastmen? It's like, well, maybe, but like, even if they were, they would be like accepted beastmen or borderline like worshipped beastmen. Like, there's notes about how the people of End bring them offerings and interact with them and like hold them in this high esteem. So like that would have allowed them to have gotten stable. That would have allowed them to establish themselves. And they're not like, are they chaos worshippers? Absolutely not, probably, because they probably didn't have to be forced into that relationship.
Exactly.
Which means that, are they beastmen in the sense that they're like, they are bestial humans? And like at the very basic core, are they beastmen? Yeah, probably. But they probably are so much different from the Empire ones, and like I bet they're less prone to mutating because they don't have that relationship with chaos of that. Yeah, they're born different. They probably have mutations, but they probably have stable mutations, not the wild
so like
craziness of beastmen.
Right, an absolute stable race, and that in the early days of Warhammer, I think it comes from the lore being developed over time, right? So originally there was the idea that beastmen were literally just mutated humans who had been abandoned as babies and dumped in the forests. And over time that developed into, no, actually they're a stable race. They reproduce, they have, they're different, they're gores, they're ungores, they're best gores.
Right.
And they reproduce like predictably according to that. So therefore, that means that beastmen are not just the product of chaos popping up all over the place, which means there's something else going on. Yeah. You could say that the only reason they even exist as a stable race is because sometime in the past something awful happened and that whole species was tainted with a touch of chaos. But that's what the elves believe about humans.
Yeah, which is, I would say that's completely accurate. Like, they have the whole thing of... the great cataclysm happened, and a fair amount of humans were either melded with animals or mutated to like reflect their inner being. And ever since then, we've had beastmen. Like, they benefit from the mutant babies, but like generally speaking, the mutant babies aren't even high up in the beastman echelon. Like on very rare occasions, they become big deals.
Yeah.
But
Andy had a fascinating character in our previous campaign. Am I allowed to say? I won't say anything about who it was or what it was, but he reversed the turnskin idea. And the beastman had a baby that was born that looked like a human. And what happened to that baby? Well, that was a question of many stories, but that then is a really interesting idea because...
Yeah, I want to say there's a reference to, it's not that specifically, but there is a reference, I want to say in the 7th edition Beastman book, to a pure Beastman child. Like it looks like a regular human. I think, I can't remember. It has like one feature that maybe is a little weird, but like
little horns. Does it not have like tiny horns?
Yeah, I think it might have like a small set of horns or something, but it's like they're considered a huge deal when they happen, and they usually go on to be quite scary. Because the Beastmen raised them, and like one of my favorite characters from a Black Library book is from the Bretonia series, Callard series, where the first book, I don't want to spoil the whole book, but the first book features as the antagonist one of these babies that was given away to the Beastmen. And like when this child grows up, they are like terrifying, and they're so angry and so resentful because they were abandoned. And they care for the Beastmen because the Beastmen raised them, but they come back for a revenge plot, and it is scary stuff. Like it's literally about them going after the parents that abandoned them to die. Like, it wasn't like the parents were like, oh, we're handing you off to the Beastmen. They leave them in the forest and are like, either an animal's going to eat you, or you'll starve, or the Beastmen will take you.
Yeah.
But like,
is that
those
one
are your
of
options.
the early novels?
Oh yeah, it's an old book. They re-released it into an omnibus. But
is it the ones?
Anthony Reynolds wrote the series, and it got re-released into an omnibus like a year ago or something.
Yeah. And so when those humans do come along, or those beastmen do, because beastmen are subject to change, so the change could be the reverse direction, or maybe never, it was never a direction at all, and they just are a different species, but, humans just, because humans sometimes mutate into things that look like beastmen, they think of beastmen as all mutated humans.
Yeah. Yotam brings up a really good point as well, is like, he says that whether or not a race is evil is kind of irrelevant if you think about it, really, because we judge that from a human perspective. But orcs aren't evil, they're just orcs. No.
They're just a force of nature. They're just something that happens.
Yeah, tornadoes aren't evil, they're just tornadoes. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Which is
her thesis was exactly that evil, it depends on your perspective, and therefore why wouldn't we be able to convert them and she was an Ulrican, so it was like, well, the force of our will could go into the forest and take them back from what they worship and make them like our allies and turn them against the forces of chaos. And the best route to that would be tough.
That would make for such a great PC, playing like someone that was born a mutant and is like hiding it, or like was even given away to the Beastmen, but they're trying to like reintegrate for whatever reason. That could make for an awesome PC, though it would be difficult. You'd have to have a good GM. But I love that so much. And I really do think that's kind of like some of the best stuff to explore. Like one of my favorite things to talk about when people bring up Beastmen are the does of that. Like there are these female Beastmen that are known for being docile. Like they're not violent. They're very they tend to be skittish for understandable reasons, but like they're not supposed to be violent a lot of the time. They tend to just avoid people. And it's like, if that's the case, then like,
and that's what triggered the character Sigrid's first thoughts in this. So obviously it was informed by her background, but she was traveling through the forests of the Empire with people, and she came upon like a war band, and that war band happened to be near their does, and the knights that she was with slaughtered those does and those babies. And they were peaceful and defenseless, and they wept and held on to their baby beastmen. And she was devastated and distraught. And it fundamentally changed her perspective. And said, well, who's really evil? Why don't they have the right to live in the forest and live their life in the forest? What are they doing to you? You just murdered, like...
Yeah, I always think...
Intelligent, and they were, they're just animals. No, but they're not, are they? They were intelligent. They cried as the babies died.
They're sapient. Yeah, full on, yeah. I think that tends to be when Warhammer, like, it's dark, but I think that tends to be when Warhammer flexes its muscles the best, is when you have those situations of like I'll never forget reading the very first Gotrek book, which is more of a collection of short stories, and they have that encounter with the Child of Ulrich. And Gotrek, being a dwarf, dwarves tend to have much more of a very strict understanding, which I think has reflected a lot in Sigmarites and humans. The dwarf, Gotrek's like, oh, it's a chaos creature, it's a werewolf essentially, like we have to kill it. And Felix is like, but she helped us, and like she also looks like a human, and Gotrek ends up killing her. And it's this really dark, sad thing of like, Gotrek's like, she's a problem, like she's got to go. And even the Cult of Ulrich is so divided on that. Like the Cult of Ulrich, when you bring up a Child of Ulrich, oh man, that's a spicy topic for them. They get really uncomfortable with that. Because, for them, it's like, some of them are like, oh, well, this person is clearly blessed by our God. And some of the others are like, no, this person is not a person. They're turning into a wolf creature. So clearly it's chaos. And it's like, maybe let's calm down a little bit. But, they're terrified the Sigmarites finding out, because the Sigmarites could wield that against them of, look, they're beastmen, or like they're worshiping beastmen. And they would totally do that if they could get away with it for political reasons.
And that strikes right to the heart of the campaign that we're playing, because, the mutant edict has just happened and said mutants are legal. And that's like every NPC we meet at the moment obviously has an opinion on that. And the opinions range from, oh my God, that's awful, how could the Emperor have done that, to quite profound questions of, well, does that mean if I now have a baby who has X that I can keep the baby? And Alamenowith has really struggled, and her and Leopold are arguing all the time, because to her mind, she doesn't see where they draw the line. What is a mutation and what is just a natural variant of humanity? Because to her, the humans all look different anyway, so how do they know? And then Leopold comes out with, well, it's clear it's a corruption of the soul, and she's like, but how can that be true? How do you know that thing is a corruption of the soul, and that bright wizard whose hair has gone orange because he's channeled the actuate so much isn't a corruption of his soul? How are you drawing these lines? How are you drawing these distinctions? And isn't that awful for you as a people? Yeah,
well, and that's such a good point of like, it shows how dangerous that dogma is of like, and why witch hunters tend to be such effective villains, or like zealous warrior priests and stuff like that. If you have these zealots who, it's like, where do they draw the line? Like if they come across a redheaded person and they've never seen a redhead, or they like, mutant, burner at the stake, and it's like, yes, they would absolutely do that. There are examples of that in the story of, there are witch hunters out there who have gone insane with their zealotry, and they kill lots of innocent people, because to them, better innocents die and go to Sigmar than we risk any taint of corruption when they're clearly going too far. Which makes for such an interesting storytelling device. And it just helps. Like Warhammer, like a lot of people, like I think 40k tends to fall into this annoying thing of like, oh, grim and gritty is all that matters. But it's like, no, in Warhammer, it's not about just the grim and gritty. It is grim and gritty, but that's not the point. It's not grimdark. It's not that there's no hope. You know, there is hope. There are people that go, no, this is dumb. We should do something different. And they have power. They're able to actually make changes. You know, like although I'm really curious how Andy's going to interpret him, but like I really like the Grand Theogenes Volkmar when he becomes Grand Theogenes because he has such a different perspective on things. Or you have like Luther Huss. Luther Huss is a very unique character because he goes around killing other Sigmarites who he's like, no, you guys suck. Like you guys are either you're chaos worshippers or you're like, you know, he's like this goofy Martin Luther. Like, yeah, he pins his thoughts on the door, but he also goes around braining overzealous witch hunters and stuff with his hammer. And it's such an awesome way to explore things of that, you know, like in a 40k campaign, I don't think you realistically, by following the lore, can have characters who are trying to make a difference. Like, it's just not really a possible thing. Whereas in fantasy, that is what you're supposed to do. Like, that is you are trying to fight the end times. You are trying to thwart the end times. Now, are you going to be able to stop it forever? Probably not. But you could delay it. You know, that's always been the goal. The goal has always been just to push the clock back another minute.
I think in the Sigmarite example, it's really easy to consider, like we were talking about with the elves and considering them as one homogenous thing. It's really easy to think of like the cult of Sigmar as, well, they're the ones who want X because, you know, they worship Sigmar, they think of Sigmar as this, but actually the Empire's pretty big. The cult of Sigmar, you know, you see it in the lore. There's this order, there's that order. And very few of them are actually blessed by Sigmar. So very few of them can actually claim to have any, and even the ones that are blessed, you don't know what Sigmar wants. You don't know what he intends. You don't know why today your prayer when you roll your dice works and tomorrow it doesn't seem to manifest as anything but, you know, helping your faith continue. Most of the Sigmarites are in politics. That's what most of them are in. So when the Grand Theogenes reacts to something, like, humans tend to think, well, yeah, he's reacting because that's what Sigmar wants. No, he's reacting like that because he's the Grand Theogenes. He probably comes from a noble family, unless, you know, he's really come up through the ranks. But really, when you look at the lore, a lot of the wizards, high-ranking wizards, a lot of the high-ranking priests
nepotism to the
are noble.
Big nepo
nepotism
babies.
to the core, right?
Nepo
Big
babies,
nepo babies. And therefore, if you look at, you know, Andy's iteration of Thyrus Gorman, of Hans Feuerbach, who was in Elric's. I don't know if you got to Elric's yet.
Yes, awesome.
They have imperial families. They're not disconnected from them. They don't go to the colleges and be like, right, see you, Dad. I know I was heir, but now I'm a wizard and I'll never speak to you again. They still have a dad who is the Duke of, I don't know, Feuerbach or whatever. Oh, he's like telling me something again. You know, they still have a dad who is somewhere, who stays in contact with them. And so while they are pressing forward the cause of their college or their cult, they're also in contact with their family. They're also pressing their own imperial politics.
It's still the person that raised you, or, you know, like, you know, or you just have those, you know, real world things. Like, in our world, like, yeah, you go on and make your own life, but you still have your family, and like, and you may even have a tumultuous relationship with your family, but still would side with them or not side with them. Like, it's complicated. It's complicated.
Yeah, and if you look at the Catholic Church, you know, if you look at the Catholic Church in the Italian city-states, you see that everywhere. You see the second sons, the third sons, the families, they go into the Catholic Church, not because they're particularly devout Catholics, but because in that time period, that was another legitimate way of getting power and getting wealth and securing it for your family.
Yeah, which is, something Yotam brought up, which I really, really like, which he was commenting on our discussion with the Beastman. He says he really finds this this conversation about Beastmen to be really fascinating in that he kind of sees that this almost looks like humanity's hubris over nature striking back and devastating us when we kind of mess with it. It's that pure form of civilization versus the chaos of nature in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which, you know, gets brought up in so many mythologies in our world, like real world mythologies, of us trying to impose order on a non-ordered world. And then getting mad when it doesn't do what we want it to.
And the interesting thing is that the wood elves are exactly the same, right? So the Azrai represent that force. So, you've got the civilization of Bretonia, and then you've got, the wild forest. The same with the Aenor a bit in the Lorelor, right? But humans are more able to see them as protectors of a forest and protectors of their own domain because they look beautiful and noble.
Right.
Full stop, right?
Whereas if it's a forest goblin on a giant spider, we're like, ah!
We're like, oh my god, how dare they? They're beasts. And so, so I've always felt that element of Wifrup has been less understood because people just pin that on the wood elves. They're like, well, yeah, the hubris of man over nature, that's represented by the wood elves butting up against the humans of Bretonia and the Empire. And I think your commenter is more correct, that actually it's all of those sentient species that occupy the Wifrup world across all the wilds that do represent that.
Yeah, I mean, for someone that wants to start their campaign a little earlier in the timeline, there's like a perfect example of like when Karl Franz takes over, one of the first things he has to deal with is a bunch of pissed off forest goblins. Because the Empire is encroaching on the in the Reichwald on the Black Pit, which is this sacred site to the forest goblins. It's where it is where the world's biggest Arachnaroks live and all this stuff. And the spider god is such a big deal. And they're encroaching on it. They're chopping down trees. They're burning away the webs and stuff. And the forest goblins are like, hey, we live here. What are you doing? And they start fighting back. And the Empire's like, oh, evil greenskins raiding and pillaging again. But debatably, like, the Empire kind of started that shit.
Yeah. And even the wood elves, right? The wood elves are colonizers of that forest. Before the wood elves were the wood elves, they were part of the Elven Empire that stretched across the world. And they lived in beautiful cities. They lived in civilizations. And after, they were called back and they had to make that choice to go and take that wood and retreat to that wood. And I think that's what, like, maybe that's an aspect of Elven history that I find really fascinating and like to explore. That actually once they were this glowing, they were the empire of the world.
Oh yeah.
And they fell, and now they're, if you look at the Azur, I would take inspiration from Michael Moorcock's, the real Melnibonians, the real, like, they're indolent, they're arrogant, they think they're so much better. Everyone thinks that the Dark Elves have slaves, but actually, if, they talk about humans living in Ulthuan.
Lothern definitely has, like, a borderline caste system going on.
Yeah. 100%.
And like, there's a lot kind of hidden under the surface of the High Elves being like, outsiders are only welcome in Lothern and will be like, it is illegal for them to go anywhere else. It's like, if you really break down that sentence and think about what the High Elves are saying, it's a little sketchy.
Yeah.
Like, even the dwarfs allow humans to visit the entirety of their realms, or like, we'll invite them in and stuff. The elves, nope. Like, Lothern is as far as you're allowed to go. They don't want your dirty
your dirty human mess all over their stuff. Yeah.
Which says a lot about them. They're world police, and they're non-ironic about it. They genuinely are like, we're gonna save the world. We already did it once, even though it was technically like a lot of different factors. But they're like, no, that's, we'll take it from here. Y'all just stay out of our way. Even though the High Elves aren't really those elves anymore. They like to think they are. They emulate them, but they're not. They're different. Which is such a good way to look at that.
Yeah, and because we talked about that right at the start, that going back to those elves that saved the world, they were drawing on the power of their whole pantheon. They were drawing upon the power of every elven deity, and now they're not. One half is sitting there, mostly the Kadai, mostly the other half, the Sithrai, and they're not going to be able to, because they're a shattered people.
Yeah, and it's like the Wood Elves are more for the Council of Beasts and the Ancients of the Forest. Like, they're really like the what you said earlier is like a lot of people don't realize that even when looking at them as like the defenders of the forest, the Azrai are hypocrites in a sense of that they're colonizers. They
are
Drycha hates them, the forest spirit, and a lot of people are like, oh, Drycha's crazy. It's like, well, she's really not. Like, even Durthu, who's considered the more reasonable, Durthu really doesn't like the elves anymore because in his mind they've brought so many problems to the forest. Granted, Adenhu the Wise, who's unfortunately no longer with us because he died purifying Ariel of her idiocy. You know, she ingested too much dark magic, getting revenge when her sister died, which is a very elf thing. Like, the forest doesn't care who dies. Like, as long as the forest continues on, it's part of life. People die. Yeah. It's the way things go. Ariel took it very personally and invaded Nagaroth and all this stuff and brought all that corruption back with her. She invited Morgar into the forest. She brought Morgar back to Athel Loren, which, like, what are you doing? Why are you bringing Morgar in here? And, like, Adenhu died for that. Like, Adenhu kind of died for no reason of purging Ariel of that. And, like, that whole concept of the Wood Elves have invited so much destruction into the forest when Adenhu initially brought them to balance the forest. Because he's like, oh, they'll prevent us from overgrowing. They'll prevent us from... Because Adenhu was scared of how the forest was being changed by chaos and that they were becoming too warlike, too aggressive, and that if it overexpanded, it would kill itself, functionally. And so he brought the elves to balance it out, and it hasn't... Like, it worked but didn't work at the same time, which is such an interesting way to explore it, of, like, the elves really do have a unique arrogance of thinking we're the best at this, or we're the protectors, and you
can
really
argue that they were brought to tend and serve and garden the forest, to be gardeners. But the thing about gardeners and tenders is that they're servants, and I would say their unique arrogance doesn't allow them to be servants, unless they're on the path of the servant, which may be a path that you could be on.
I'm sure. Yeah, and it's like they have such a, like, it's like even like the relationship with Bretonnia, where you have like the Azrae manipulating the Bretonians, and like they should be more invested in taking care of the Bretonians because then they have a good shield, but instead they're assholes about it. Like, they treat them badly and stuff, and it blows up in their face. Like, the Lady of the Lake gets mad at them constantly. And then they have this angry god they have to deal with, who debatably is one of, who, you know, may or may not be one of their gods. And it's like, you know, you're goofing up when one of your own gods who's moonlighting as someone else is like, guys, what are you doing?
I love that.
Stop it.
Moonlighting for someone else.
But I love so much that there's so many cool facets to explore Warhammer through, of like it really does allow for explorations of all these different things. And like one of the just the stupid segue, but like one of the things I've been enjoying so much about Age of Sigmar is that it kind of has removed even more tethers of like, you can really explore anything in Age of Sigmar. They've completely removed the ropes. Even the roleplay game, they're like, hey, you want to have an undead in your order party? Cool. Here's some reasons that could potentially happen. Or like, you want to have an orc in your party? Cool. Like, you know, we'll give you some bullshit so you can make it work. Like in Wolfrep, you theoretically could do that, but the world doesn't.
The world would be
it'll fight back. Yeah. It'll fight back.
Yeah,
big time.
Absolutely.
You know, it's like we're playing a Illustria campaign on stream here on Thursdays, which I'm having a ton of fun with. But like, even playing a skink, playing a lizardman in Wolfrep is hard. Like, if you're doing it right, or if you're really wanting it to be lore accurate, either you have to be playing Illustria campaign, or you got to do some serious legwork, because the world doesn't really fit around that mold. I'd say even for playing an elf is really hard for Wolfrep. Like, if you're in a lot of these human environments, like, you're kind of looking at the elf stuff and it's like, man, this it can be tough. It can be really hard for people. Understandably, which is really why I hope they release more books from other races' perspectives, so we can have campaigns and with like different party comps in different parts of the world.
That would be brilliant, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
like to actually have an elf party, and because part of the challenge of playing an elf is that you do have baseline better stats. And so you've got potential, sometimes you've got people in the party who are like, my specialism is X, and you're like, yeah, but baseline, I'm already for starter characters, not for more specialized ones, I would say, because people do specialize down lines. But when you're first start, you know, your biggest drawback is you don't have very many fate points, so your elf is probably going to die.
Yeah.
But it can be a little bit like, oh, more elf bullshit.
Yeah.
But if you would like set a campaign and have a party of elves, that could be really, really interesting to explore that. And actually, but you could still play humans with that. What might be really we were talking yesterday, is it Sunday? Yeah, yesterday on Inside the Rookery about different ways to balance power disparities and having like the Scooby Gang approach to role playing. You could have people who played humans and played their ancestors. So you could have an elf who played over a long period of a campaign, but you could also have humans, but they were humans who were like coming in, and that would be
really
cool.
fun, actually.
Yeah.
That would be a really interesting way to get to play like a bunch of different characters while also kind of playing the same character.
Yeah, and kind of playing the same story. So you as a player got the continuity of what could be quite an epic story. Like imagine if you set it in the world that was, and you set it just before the time of Magnus, and maybe you're playing an elf who, I know that only like the 3 elves came over, but they brought other elves with them, right, to train the wizards. So you could play someone who'd come along with them as an elf to train those wizards, and then you could have a human that you played who right then wasn't in the colleges because they'd all been summoned and they were being taught magic, and then you could play like a sequence of magisters, wizards,
that would be so
up to
cool.
current day. But you could have someone who continued playing that elf who could see how the colleges developed and how the people developed. It would be quite fun.
It would, dude, especially if you have someone good playing an elf. I cannot imagine how annoying it would be to be a human hanging out with an elf who knew like your many times ancestor and is like, yeah, your dad was better at that or something like that. You're just like, shut up, dude. Like, or like, and,
or patronizing, the patronizing.
They'd be
like,
so.
Oh, you have come on so far since your ancestors first dabbled in the winds of magic. Like shut up.
Like even if they're trying to be nice, it would be the most like, just dude, stop talking. I don't.
Yeah.
I love that, and that would allow for so many interesting explorations too. Of like one of my favorite books about a dwarf is I forget what the name of the book is, but it's about Barendon Stoneheart, the king of Zuthbar, and it has this really poignant scene where he meets a human who like really surprises him because the human commits patricide to get rid of kills his dad, who was planning on hurting the dwarves. And he was like, nope, I killed my dad. So y'all, here's your gold. We don't have to fight all the stuff. And the dwarves are like, rah, rah, like they have they have a short circuit because he did patricide for a good reason, which to them is just not possible. But he did. And there's this sad scene where like it skips ahead and Barendon's talking to who he thinks is the same guy. And like, they're having a conversation. He's like, oh yeah, like how are things? Like, how's life going? How's your family stuff? And the guy's like, oh, you're talking about my grandfather? He died like 30 years ago. Like, I'm his grandson. I'm so-and-so. And Barendon's like, oh, yeah, that's right. And like Barendon has this weird moment where he's really sad because he's like, he really liked that guy and he knew him his entire life. But from a dwarf perspective, it's kind of an eye blink. From an elf perspective, like, holy crap. Like, like I think it's Carillion calls them mayflies in Vermintide, which is so accurate. They live for a day, like from an elf perspective. Yeah.
And from an elf perspective, when emotions are so important and your passions rise so high and your soul flares so brightly, it's really dangerous to make connections with humans because you're constantly losing them and experiencing pain. It's almost like elves. Another reason that elves hold themselves apart with that, it's that arrogance is a shield because it's painful. And in a way, like we joke about it, and it's not like this because of course humans are sentient, but my character, Alimenowith, doesn't have heals, she's got animal care, and I was always saying jokingly to the guys, so I don't have, can I just use animal care on them? And I was like, stop it.
Oh my God. Yes.
But with a serious point, that the reason I had first thought of that as a joke was because that Tumblr post about how humans are elves to dogs.
Yes, I love that.
Right?
Even though it pulls at heartstrings, I wish it didn't. But yes, I love that so much.
Well, exactly. And it pulls at heartstrings because we all recognize that. We've got a cat, Shadow, and I love him so much. He's a part of my family. And that's what it would be like for elves to have humans around. You'd constantly have your heartstrings pulled. And when you're an elf and you're an eternal teenager, that would really hurt. Every time. Yeah.
Well, you don't get used to it. Like, you don't get that.
You don't get used to it.
Yeah, you don't get the adjustment of like, oh, I'm older, so I can control these emotions. Yeah. No, they're always. It'd be even worse because it's not even like you get them for 20 years. It'd be like rats. Like, I know some people have had rats and they're like, I love having them. I can't do it anymore because they only live for 2 years. And it's like, ugh.
Yeah, I couldn't. I've said that about some of people I know that have had rats and smaller animals, and I'm like, I just know that my heart couldn't take that. I would get so attached, and some elves wouldn't get attached, you know.
Yeah.
But some elves would get
Yeah,
attached.
the Tyrion versus Teclis dilemma. Yeah.
Well, exactly. Yeah.
The Tyrion's like, humans, who cares? And Teclis is like, no.
Yeah,
we like them.
We like them. But yeah, if you got attached to them repeatedly, you'd be constantly putting yourself through pain that you know is going to come.
Yeah, which I think for a lot of people, like that always comes up in the like immortal dilemma. You know, would you be immortal if you could? You know, you have the people that say no, because like I wouldn't want to go through the hurt of my loved ones dying constantly. And it's like,
yes.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily do that if you were immortal. Or granted, like it's I've always found that an interesting argument, because it's like, well, humans in a way, like some humans get used to that, or some humans are just able to handle it better. Like I don't know why, like I don't think it's a bad trait necessarily, but like when I've lost family members, like my grandparents and stuff like that, like it was sad, but it wasn't like soul crushing. It was kind of like, yeah, like it sucks, but like I'm able to accept it and kind of keep going. Like, I don't know if that's gonna get worse, you know, when it's like my parents or my friends and stuff like that. It probably will. But it's like, but like for an elves, like they kind of have the absolute worst case scenario of that. Of they are the immortal who does feel it. So like, how do they handle that?
Yeah, and if elves love, they love, and if they grieve, they grieve, and they can and they can get lost in that.
Yeah, which is so perfect of like in the lore, we see a lot of elves, like most elves don't take marriage partners. And if they do, they take one, period. Yeah. Now they tend to have a lot of lovers, but it's not considered the same thing at all by a country mile.
Yeah, exactly. Does the Everqueen love the Phoenix King? That's a political union. Clearly, sometimes they might not. But you know, she'll have other lovers, he'll have other lovers, but they've got this cultural, traditional union to create that air.
Tyrion gets a lot of flack because he doesn't sleep around. He's purely dedicated to Alariel, and all the elves are like, that's weird.
That's
like,
weird.
What is he doing?
Yeah, like, what's wrong with you? Yeah.
Why is he so dedicated? What is going on with him? Like, he's on the path of Alariel. Like, he is very one track.
Really strange for them. And we've used that to inform. So once you accept that, and once you say, right, human, and again, like we've thought about that in a like evolutionary perspective. Why would that be? Why do elves have fewer like sexual dimorphic features than humans do? Why do elves care less about X, Y, and Z? And you can often answer those questions with elf bullshit or magic. But you can also come up with like interesting reasons. Well, maybe elves choose to get when they get pregnant. Maybe they have, because you know elves have got more control over their body and the flows of magic. They can choose. And so therefore, amongst humans, you know, the course of your bloodline and whether you've reproduced and the DNA push and the evolutionary hormones and therefore emotions that creates are then cut out of the agenda. You know, they're just cut. So of course Tyrion could sleep around because it doesn't have the same weight as it would in a human society, and the fact that he doesn't is actually what makes him really unusual. Like, his monogamy is a feature that is weird about him.
Yeah, that and that, you know, there's got to be something. It's one of those things I always wish kids, like, I love that they talked about dwarves and they were like, yeah, dwarves, like, they tend to take this long to have kids. There's 1 in 7. Halflings, we know a lot about halfling reproduction. Elves, they're just like, nope, we're not. Like, because I always love the eternal question of how are the elves a dying race, and yet the dark elves are unleashing like these titanic hordes on Ulthuan, where like thousands and thousands die on both sides, and yet they're both still going.
Well, I think that is a really good question, and how massive is Athel Loren, and how many elves are there? So I would say I always imagined. I always imagined that there were hardly any elves, but there can't be hardly any elves.
Yeah, they field armies, like, so like, what's going on?
There must be millions. And in the, you know, we talked right at the start about the high elves maybe having they've become a bit indolent and a bit less, I don't know, vibrant and energetic than the dark elves
high elves
are.
don't want to. Versus, like, not like they're actively making the decision. It's like the whatever's supposed to drive them just isn't there. Which, hey, they don't worship authority. Like, they don't have that. That could play into it a little bit. Like, dark elves are very passionate. They're like the most passionate of the passionate. They are all in on that, and they seem to have, like, they talk about having tons of kids a lot. Like, whenever we see dark elves pop up in Black Library books, they have tons of siblings. Like, there's like family dynamics and all this stuff. Whereas high elves, you have one kid per family traditionally. And it feels like
the Druchii are a younger race than the Azur. So the Azur stayed behind and were changed, and their society fundamentally changed. But they still believe they're that same old race. They still it's like British people who think that like Britain is still like rule Britannia and all that bullshit, right? Whereas actually,
the high elves always give me that strong vibe of like, oh, we're Rome when Rome was amazing, when in reality they're Rome many thousands of years later.
Because if you look at it, there are elven ruins everywhere across the world. There are cities like Nuln that are built on massive old elven cities, and once the heart of their empire was Ulthuan. Right, which means that once their empire spanned the whole globe, there would have been millions and millions and millions of elves.
Oh yeah,
tens of billions, and the high elves think they're still that, and it's like, you're just not. You are absolutely not in any way that anymore.
Cities that are mostly empty, and like they're struggling. Like, they're trying to maintain that global presence, like with all the different towers on the oceans and stuff. But like, really, they're only a naval power now, because as a naval power, they don't need as many people, and they could be more mobile. Whereas it's like Athel-Loren gets to cheat, because at least like in Athel-Loren we know that like the forest keeps them at a specific number through weird forest magic. Or if like, oh, an elf died, well, guess what? You're pregnant now.
Here's a new elf.
So like continuing the cycle. But they're in a contract, like they're literally bound in a magical contract. There's no way out. It's like it's almost kind of it depend. Like, I would not be surprised if there was an Azray that almost feels despairing about it. I think I recall there being maybe back in the 6th edition Wood Elf book, there's a Wood Elf or Athel-Loren Wood Elf mother talking to her child, and she's explaining like the laws of the forest of like, this is what you learn, this is why we're isolationists, this is why we don't interact with the other races, and it's a very matter of fact, this is our bargain, like this is our role. And there is no escape from that, which is like kind of scary in a lot of ways.
It's the price they paid for survival.
Yeah.
They paid a price to survive, and they chose, maybe they didn't realize what the full impact would be over the long term, but that's it. It's done now. Whereas I think the Dark Elves, like, I think, Malekith still has that absolute drive to conquer, to take back what was his, to rule. And so, when the elves were young, when they were a younger race, they must have been massively populous to have spread over the world, to have massive, huge cities that are now, the foundations of most of the major cities across the world.
Yeah,
which
Talea,
means
Estalia, Bretonia, the Empire, they're all over the place.
Which means once they were a very, populous and vibrant people who had many, many children, just like the Dark Elves do now. The difference with the Dark Elves now is probably their death rate is higher than it would have been at the height of elven glory.
Malekith really embraces that survival of the fittest. By the way, we're going to have auditions every day.
Yeah, exactly. Survive every day. Yeah. So, but they prove that the elves are not a non-fecund and fertile people. It's just something's happened to the high elves.
Yeah, which I love that so much, because it does fill in that gap really well of that, like, and it also kind of adds like an extra almost spiritual level to the dying race thing of like there really is something more going on more deeply that like it's affecting them on such a fundamental level. Like, is it that chaos has warped them in some little way, or is it that maybe only worshiping the Kadai has had this impact on them? Which I would suspect is probably very heavily at play. Because, man, the Kadai come off very purist.
Yeah, and because the flip side of the Dark Elves mostly worshipping the I can never pronounce it, the Sithari.
Sithari.
Cithari is the reverse. They've got the vitality and they've got the energy and they've got the high elves don't have, but they're dying so quickly because they're constantly thrusting themselves into the darkness of war and all the destruction of the other side of the Pantheon.
Burning themselves out. Yeah.
They've got creation, but they've got destruction, whereas they've got sort of just this ennui. Yeah, so they're burning themselves out, and really, they need to... and that's where the Aenir are like, well, there was another way. Before the Sundering, there was another way, and that was the way that yielded the glory of the elves. Not the high elves, not the dark, the glory of the elves. So the Aenir would view themselves as elves. We're the elves.
The Aenir are so tiny. Like, they're not even like... It's not even like Athel Loren. Like, they're just it's like a city with some outskirts.
I think Andy's interpretation of that will be different, I suspect, given how big the Empire is. What is the actual volume of the lore? Floor space of the Lorelorn. How many are there really?
Yeah, I would love to see them kind of like more of a force on their own. But I mean, even then, like compared to the others who are practically like countries or continents.
Absolutely. Yeah. They are just a small part of a bigger area.
But I love the idea that like they're struggling so hard to figure it out, especially because like they're in a very vulnerable position compared to the other three. They don't have an ocean or mountains or a magical like Lorelorn's got some magic to it, but it's not nearly as like sentient or crazy as Athel Loren is. Like they're far more vulnerable to outside predations than the others.
And what's their play? What's Queen Maris's play in the end game?
Yeah, I was so happy to see Lorelorn return because there's so many interesting like. I feel like there's so much more of an interesting dynamic to be told, especially with like the rise of Kazrak the One-Eye, of like, he's a big threat in that area. Granted, he has that huge hate boner, like him and Boris, like just kiss already. Like they have such a massive hate boners for each other. It's like, but Lorelorn would almost certainly play into that of like, what are they doing about that? There's the biggest, scariest beast lord since Gothor rising up, and they're like, this guy's a problem. He's bringing all these beastmen into the area, and they are ready to fight. But oh my gosh, we've been going for almost 2 hours, which is a super long time. If there's anything else you had, I don't want to keep you any hostage any longer. But this has been super fun. I've been having an absolute blast with the conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for I love to geek. So you were like, oh, it's your Sunday, and I'm like, no, like usually Andy and I would be talking about this on a Sunday anyway, so I might as well do it with someone else on the internet. So yeah, it was an absolute pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me. I think the last thing I would say about the Aenir and what the Aenir are up to is that because there's such a political part of the elves, I would say the way we're going to interpret them is almost everything you read in the lore is someone else's perspective. And the fascinating thing about them is that unlike Athel Loren, who really don't care about the Empire and what happened in the Empire, and unlike the High Elves, who'll dip in and out every few, 100 years, the Aenir have been there since the time of Sigmar, and they saw what happened. And they've seen the Empire grow. And so some of the things that for humans are lost in the mists of time, they might actually hold the secrets that of the truth of who was Sigmar, what did he do?
They played such a big role. I mean, I loved in their role they played in the Skaven invasion back during the Black Plague stuff, which humanity has completely forgotten about.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I'm sure everybody else is like, how? It hasn't even been that long. How'd you guys already forget?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, that is fantastic. All right, so
so the other thing I would say is if you've enjoyed this chat, come and join Inside the Rookery, where we stream every Saturday night with guests from all over the TTRPG, the video game industry, loads of authors. Had people like Gareth L. Powell on recently, Gar Hanrahan, Andy Hall's been on it. So yeah, do check that out. Check out the Patreon, check out our Discord community, which is where we gather and ask all the pre-questions and just generally chat about all the geeky nerdy stuff we love.
Yes, and it's a very vibrant and awesome community. I'm in there lurking all the time, which all those links will be somewhere.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Around here, like pin comment and stuff for those on YouTube or whatever. And I'll also make sure, if you haven't, check out LAWhammer on YouTube as well. And the Wolfrip series, so you can see a lot of the stuff we've talked about kind of come to light. There's a couple things that were still secret, so those will be revealed with time. So it should be super fun and exciting. And that's pretty much it. So thank you all so much for watching. And Lindsay, thank you so much for coming by. Really, really appreciated having you on. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you so much. I've had a great time. Thanks everyone for watching.
Yeah, thank y'all for watching. See y'all next time. And I'm not gonna bother with a raid because I'd have to figure that. I'd have to do stuff. Whatever. I'll be back later. I'll see you guys later. Bye.
Bye.